Welcome to the 128th season of the Canadian Club Toronto, Canada's Podium. For over a century, this platform has been a gathering place for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to discuss the most pressing issues of our time.
We've been having important discussions and debates around this podium in this country for well over a century. I call this a historic podium of record.
Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Tanya Van Biesen, Canadian Club Toronto President and your host for today. The Canadian Club of Toronto is committed to exploring the forces shaping our nation. Today, we welcome two leaders to our podium, both with a transformative vision for Indigenous economic participation in our country. Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, will share her perspective on self-determination and the vital partnerships needed to build a stronger Canada. Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, will offer her perspective on the importance of building vital partnerships and creating opportunities for Indigenous businesses also across Canada. The Q&A portions of today's conversation will be moderated by my board colleague, Katherine Koostachin. Now, before the formal speaker introductions, I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, of which we thankfully have several. So first, thank you to Canadian Bankers Association, our season sponsor, and to Air Canada, our official airline. Thank you also to Canada's Forest Trust, who is working closely with us to help reduce our carbon footprint. Through this partnership, we've planted and protected 1,750 trees to date. And of course, we are extremely grateful to today's event sponsors, TC Energy, Red Jar Energy, and Borden Ladner Gervais. Thank you all for your contribution. Now, in the room today, we have students from the University of Toronto's Indigenous Studies program. I want to say a hearty welcome to you, and we do hope that you will have great questions for our speakers. I'd also like to share a few club announcements before we begin the event discussion. First, I would encourage all of you to visit our website at canadianclub.org, where you will find both event and membership information. And if you've missed a past event, we have a great popular on-demand service where you can access any of those past events. I'd also like to highlight a couple of our upcoming events that we hope you will join us for. On April 2nd, we will host Chantal Butler, CEO of Molson Coors Canada. On April 3rd, we will host the Premier of New Brunswick, the Honourable Susan Holt. On April 10th, we will host a breakfast with François Poirier, the CEO of TC Energy. And on that same day at lunch, just in case you're not busy and you have nothing else to do, we will be hosting a great conversation with the Terry Fox Foundation around their new innovative research funds. And that's just the beginning of April, so we will have much more coming your way. Now, we love it when you share our events on social media, so I encourage you to share today's event and details of your event experience on your favorite platform. And we also love it when you ask questions of our speakers. So you will have that opportunity with both of our speakers today. For those in the room, you will find Q&A cards on the table, and they will be collected by our staff, who will bring them up to Katherine, our moderator. And for those joining remotely, please hit the red Q&A button on the right side of your screen when we open the floor for questions. And now I would like to invite Tiffany Murray, Director, Indigenous Relations at TC Energy, to introduce our guest speakers. Tiffany, over to you.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Grand Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak, honored elders and distinguished guests, good afternoon. For those of you I have not had the privilege of meeting before, I'm Tiffany Murray and I'm the Director of Indigenous Relations for TC Energy. And I'm thrilled to be here today to introduce our speakers. So for those of you who may not be familiar, TC Energy is a North American energy infrastructure company. We're focused primarily on natural gas infrastructure, power, and energy solutions. With more than 6,500 employees across Canada, the US, and Mexico, many of whom live and work around and within Indigenous communities, we're committed to helping address the energy trilemma, the need to balance energy security, affordability, and sustainability. Working with over 395 Indigenous communities across Canada, we recognize that meaningful Indigenous engagement is foundational to our work through building enduring relationships, respectful and mutually beneficial partnerships. Our goal is to ensure that projects reflect Indigenous values, priorities, and economic aspirations. I've had the privilege throughout my career to listen and to learn from many inspiring and visionary Indigenous leaders across the country to help build stronger partnerships between Indigenous communities, government, and industry. I've seen firsthand the strength, innovation, and leadership Indigenous peoples bring to every sector, from energy, governance, to business, policy, and beyond. That's why today's conversation is so important. As we look towards the next federal election, First Nations priorities must be front and center of the national dialogue. Issues like infrastructure, economic participation, they're not just Indigenous issues, they are Canadian issues. We're fortunate today to be joined by three exceptional women who are working very hard to help shape a stronger and more inclusive future. Tabatha Bull, President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business from Nipissing First Nation, has a background in engineering and a deep commitment to economic inclusion. She's helping build an economy that reflects the strength and diversity of Indigenous entrepreneurs, all while raising two young athletes, I understand. We're also joined today by Katherine Koostachin, Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation for Sussex Strategy Group. Katherine is from Attawapiskat First Nation and brings over 15 years of experience in law, policy, and governance. She's helped shape national reconciliation efforts and has delivered critical investments to Indigenous communities. And finally, we're honored to welcome our keynote speaker, National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak from Pinnimoontang First Nation. The National Chief holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Winnipeg and completed the Harvest Business School's Tribal Leaders Program, blending traditional knowledge with modern governance and business tools. Since her election in December 2023, she has brought bold, clear leadership to the Assembly of First Nations. From negotiating the historic First Nations child welfare settlement to advocating in Parliament and at cabinet tables, she has always championed the rights, jurisdiction, and priorities of First Nations peoples. But more than her achievements, what sets National Chief Woodhouse Nepinak apart is her vision. As a leader and as a mother of three, she speaks often to our shared responsibility to the next 7 generations and the work we all must do to create a future where First Nations children thrive in prosperity, balance, and pride. Today, she will share the AFN's 2025 election priorities, a clear and urgent call to all political leaders across the country, because Indigenous peoples are rights holders, critical economic drivers, and nation-to-nation partners. So it is now my honor to welcome to the stage National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak.
Thank you. It's such a beautiful day to have all of you here, and spring is coming soon. And I think before we begin, I want to thank and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And I want to thank the Canadian Club for the invitation to attend today. I also want to recognize and acknowledge Chief Don Miracle, who's now not here. Chief Conrad Ritchie, nice to see you, Avsagin, and Chief Ted Williams, where are you, Ted? Chief Williams, if you can stand, this is one of our other chiefs as well. We're very progressive, and thank you for being here. I also want to thank President Tanya Van Biesen, Vice President Katherine Koostachin, and founder Willa Black from the Canadian Club for the invitation to speak today. I also want to acknowledge Tabatha Bull for the good work she is doing at the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. So thank you all for being here. And you know, before I begin and get into my remarks, one of the most important things as a mother that you're ever going to do is you're going to pick a partner and to have children with. And that's one of my greatest gifts, of course, is being a mother to my beautiful 3 children. But in doing so, I had to pick a partner, and I thought, well, I got to pick somebody smart, because you don't want somebody to, you know, so you have these beautiful children and you think, okay, wow, you know, you're such a smart person. And so in choosing, I said, well, he's educated, he's got a bachelor of, you know, he's got a business degree, and he's got an education degree. And I thought, okay, well, you know, that's my person, you know, that's who I'll have children with. So 2 weeks ago was my birthday, right? But a month ago, I said to him, hey, I had a dream of a necklace and a ring. And he said, oh, just wait until your birthday. So a couple weeks ago, of course I was busy. I was in Washington. I don't know if Tabatha was there with me or not, I can't remember, but you know, Washington, busy, on the road, day in, day out, and it's just nonstop. So of course I get home a couple of days later and there's a box in my house. So I opened it and he's there and he says, I remembered your dream. Okay, great. You're so smart, you know? So I opened the box and I undid my gift, and it was a book, How to Interpret Dreams. But thank you, and thank you for the warm welcome, the love that I feel in this room, the lightness after a very heavy night, which I could maybe talk about at the end of this speech. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak. Hello, Josh Favel. He's a young up-and-coming lawyer, and I'm so proud of you to see you here in the crowd. I bring greetings to you on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations, which include over 600 strong independent First Nations from coast to coast to coast on what we now know as Canada. As a national political advocacy organization for First Nations in our beautiful country, the Assembly of First Nations advances inherent and treaty rights through the co-development of policy, public education, and legislation. My role as National Chief is to advocate for First Nations priorities as directed by chiefs to protect these collective and inherent rights. And it's an honor to be here on behalf of the chiefs of these nations and in the spirit of our ancestors. I grew up surrounded by my family and my culture, and most importantly, my language on the Penamutang First Nation. It's just a few hours north of where the Forks is currently in Winnipeg. And I was blessed to grow up with my loving mother, my father, and my great-grandmother, who helped raise me 3 days of the week because she was a widow. And so my mom always made me go sleep at Granny's for 3 days of the week. And I think that was one of our traditional ways of First Nations, that the first grandchild always kind of went to the grandparents. And I recognize that now, that I remember she'd make me go to bed before the sun went down, right? And she'd make us get up as soon as the sun got up. But more importantly, every evening she would pray with me, and I had to sit and listen to the Anishinaabe language. And there's nothing now that I couldn't give back for that. I know at Mom and Dad's I got TV and stuff, but Granny taught me a different set of values on those days that I was with her, and I want to uplift her, and I know she's looking down, and I thank her for her guidance and her love in my life. And she raised my mother and my mother, my mom was her grandchild, so she was my great-grandmother, but Mom's mom and then her white father had an Indian mother, both left her on the community, and Mom became, she was kind of sent home to home first as a baby. Long story, but it was really kind of sad, and everything that could happen to a child happened to my mother. And I watched my mother, and she's not here today, but I just look at her that she's so inspiring to, I thought, here you are. She remembers Indian agents coming when she was, 9 years old, and for the first time, she was able to take bread to school, because it was always bannock, right? Granny made bannock every day. But I watched her become over all odds, and she just loved school so much that she went to school, and then she went to university, and Mom raised me and all my brothers. I have a lot of older brothers, so I was the only girl. And she raised us, and she had her Bachelor of Education, then her Master's, and yet she had every single obstacle against her. And I know I give my dad credit as well, but I look at my mom and think, here was a woman that shouldn't have been married to the chief's son, right? Everybody put her down for it, and she had raised a beautiful family with my brothers and I, and we couldn't thank her more than enough, and I just lift up my mother today. I also want to say that I watched my dad lead as a counselor, and then of course as a chief, and and then our grandfather, our great-great-great-grandfather was Chief Richard Woodhouse, who was an original signatory to Treaty Number 2 that was signed on August 21st of 1871. And, when I'd met the royal family, I'd met Prince William and talking with him, and I'm like, can you imagine, your grandma, Queen Victoria, gave this to my grandfather, Chief Woodhouse, and this original medal, and we have this history with each other. And I always look back to that, where we come from, and, a girl, I'm off script a little bit, but, and then looking at old Indian affairs stuff, Dominion of Canada, stuff from the 1800s, and then I see my grandfather on the front of this cover, and one of the girls in my office, her great-great-great-grandfather, and I said, can you imagine that 145 years later that we're still here fighting to make this country a more inclusive place? And I think we've come a long way, and we have a long way to go, but we've come a long way together. So I want to lift all of us up for being here today and having these discussions about that. And without the gift of being surrounded by my culture and my language, I could not be standing before you today doing this work. Since being elected National Chief over a year ago, we have dedicated time to meet with business leaders as we travel across the country, and sometimes it's good for us to talk without the government always in the room. They're always in the room. So they're not here today. When I first accepted this invitation, I had no idea that we would be into day 3 of perhaps one of the most important federal elections in this country's history. So today I dedicate my time to the election and the central role that First Nations issues will play, not only in the result, but also the success of whichever government emerges. Excuse me. A moment. Before I get into the election, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize our outgoing Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. And during his decade in power, Mr. Trudeau did more to help improve the quality of life for First Nations than any other Prime Minister in the history of this country. And Katherine, I know I see you sitting there, and I think of you and I lift you up as well. You were in the midst of all that work all these years, and I think we all owe her a round of applause. It's been tough. While many generational and rights challenges remain unresolved, the former Prime Minister has been an ally for meaningful reconciliation. He had set a new standard for future Prime Ministers to exceed. Personally, I expect Justin will continue to be a good relative in his future pursuits because of the work that he's done so far. Too many issues remain unresolved. From First Nations policing and the incomplete Clean Water Act to unfinished reform of the child welfare system, we look forward to working with the next Prime Minister and the Canadian Parliament to pick up where the previous Prime Minister is leaving off. As we have done in previous elections, the Assembly of First Nations will present each political party with a priorities document that highlights issues we expect the next government must be prepared to address with First Nations people. Over the past week, we've had the opportunity to talk with all of the leaders. We've met with the Conservative opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre. We've met with the new Liberal Prime Minister on the Anishinaabe-Algonquin territory on Parliament Hill on Friday. We have engaged with leaders of, Mr. Jagmeet Singh, the NDP, the Green, and we've even invited the Bloc Québécois. And I know that they, our chiefs are pretty tough on them, but to each, I say the same thing to them. We expect all federal parties and the next government and elected MPs to work with First Nations for a secure, safe, and prosperous country for First Nations and for all Canadians. We've made sure each leader understands that every First Nations is determined to build a new relationship with the Crown, built on mutual respect and the full implementation of the First Nations treaty rights, our inherent rights, and our jurisdiction. We are also reminding the leaders that 2025 is not just an election year. It is also the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission historic calls to action this coming December. So the 2025 federal election is an opportunity to measure progress towards reconciliation and hold political parties accountable for survivors, families, and First Nations across this beautiful country. In addition to the calls to action, the Assembly of First Nations Priorities document will reflect policy resolutions approved by our chiefs in Assembly for the United Nations Declaration Act and the calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. We will reflect a unified call from the First Nations chiefs across this country and call on the next government to finally recognize First Nations jurisdiction and finally legislate First Nations policing as an essential service. As the National Chief, I think before I get into that a little bit more, it's really tough on Saturday nights when chiefs call me from different small communities in the north and they don't have access to a policing service. And I don't think any community in this country would stand for that, a small community or a big city. And I think that we can do better as a country when it comes to public safety for all. In addition to long-term police funding, we will call for a public inquiry to the alarming number of First Nations still dying in the custody of colonial forces in Canada. Our AFN platform will also focus on health and the well-being of First Nations children, families, and future generations. For too many years, First Nations have been fighting in the courts to fix Canada's discriminatory child welfare system that picked up right where residential schools left off. This is why we will be pressing all parties for a commitment to an improved mandate for long-term reform of Canada's racist First Nations child welfare system. We also want to take this opportunity to lift up the Chiefs of Ontario, some of them are here today, for their leadership in finalizing a historic $8.5 billion First Nation child welfare agreement just last month with the federal government, so we lift you up in a good way. The agreement will create sweeping positive changes for First Nations children and families in this region. And we understand this funding will start flowing as early as next week, so we lift you all up and thank you for your work on that. While we face many challenges over the past year, the Ontario Child Welfare Agreement is another hard-fought victory, reaffirming our inherent rights. We want to lift up the chiefs that have been taking these fights to the courts as a last resort. We always want to negotiate first, and I think many of us in this room are here because we want to negotiate. We don't want to be in court, but unfortunately First Nations are going to court and they are winning, and they're winning in a good way, but it shouldn't have to be so hard fought. In December, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal and provincial governments can no longer discriminate against First Nations by underfunding policing services in our communities. Last February, the Supreme Court also reaffirmed that First Nations jurisdiction over their children and child welfare. And we think of the successful appeal for the Robinson-Huron and Robinson-Superior treaties, where billions in compensation is expected. There have been major victories in British Columbia, in the Yukon, and the Quebec Court for First Nations on mineral rights. And there are more, and there will be more, if First Nations are not fully included in the renewal of Canada's economy. Each decision sends a message to federal and provincial governments that First Nations cannot be left on the sidelines. And I've reiterated that to every leader last week. So I'm going to conclude my remarks today to this point and talk about economic reconciliation. In our new era, unfortunately, of U.S. colonialism, economic reconciliation will be a key feature of the AFN Elections Priorities document. not just because it's a moral and legal obligation for Canada under the United Nations Declaration, but it's also a strategic advantage for our future generations. Fully empowering First Nations will unlock a wealth of potential and innovation that will drive Canada's collective prosperity and economic growth. That was true before Trump 2.0, and it is even more important now. So first, let me say, as National Chief, I will stand with First Nations across the country in strongly condemning the imposition of tariffs by the United States government. The short-sighted action of Trump and statements about forcing Canada to become part of the United States through economic coercion are a violation of international law. First Nations have inhabited these territories long before colonial borders were established. Our lands hold vast deposits of critical minerals, forests, and freshwater supplies that sustain communities on both sides of the border. So during this election, we are calling on each of the federal leaders to commit to including First Nations in discussions between premiers and the US officials. At this critical time in this country's history, it's so important to recognize Canada's gross domestic product is generated off First Nations lands and resources. Keeping First Nations out of these very crucial conversations that impact our treaty rights is no longer acceptable. It is 2025, and it is not Team Canada without treaty and inherent rights holders at the table. Our next Prime Minister must understand that we won't defeat Trump's colonialism with more colonialism here at home. Canada must walk the talk of anti-colonialism by holding up the principle of equality of all peoples and the right to self-determination of First Nations. By ignoring well-established treaty and inherent rights that have been upheld by Canada's highest courts, it's not a winning strategy, particularly as it relates to agreements regarding our water, Arctic sovereignty, and sustainable natural resource development. Canada can demonstrate to the world that it's still possible to win by being inclusive and respecting the rights of others. We are here to say that during this election that Canada's First Nations are ready to unlock growth that will drive Canada's collective prosperity and economic growth for the next century. With each day, more Canadians recognize Canada's economy will not achieve its full potential until we have a strong First Nations economy. First Nations businesses already contribute over $50 billion to Canada's GDP. This represents a 57% increase over the previous decade. The rest of Canada grew by 37% during the same period. Over $560 billion worth of projects are forecast to be launched on our traditional lands over the next decade. The potential benefit of these projects, including the Ring of Fire here in Ontario, is in the trillions of dollars. They represent a cornerstone of Canada's future economic growth, but they won't advance without the support of First Nations. Our Assembly of First Nations election platform priorities will ask each of the parties to describe their approach to achieving the full potential of economic reconciliation if elected, starting with closing Canada's well-documented First Nations infrastructure gap. Closing the First Nations infrastructure gap starts with the basics of development. To thrive, First Nations must have access to adequate infrastructure, such as clean water, quality housing, reliable roads, power supplies, schools, and high-speed internet. The Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada estimated that $350 billion is needed to achieve the federal government's goal of closing this gap by 2030. According to the Conference Board of Canada, this investment has the potential to generate over $635 billion in economic output over the next 7 years. This means each dollar invested to close the First Nations infrastructure gap would contribute $1.82 in economic output to Canada. This means Canada moves from last to first amongst G7 countries in average annual GDP per capita growth. This means over 330,000 full-time jobs per year, with 91% of those held by non-First Nations people. Beyond the infrastructure gap, we will call on the next federal government to support First Nations ownership of major infrastructure projects on our territories. While we welcome the $5 billion First Nation Loan Guarantee Program announced in the 2024 federal budget, it must be expanded. To realize the potential of these nation-building opportunities, we estimate that those guarantees need to be in the range of $100 billion. In this election, we will be asking the leaders to state their vision for the Loan Guarantee Initiative and any other measures that they plan to introduce that will ensure First Nations receive sustainable benefit from projects on our lands. Just in conclusion, so you've heard a sneak peek of what our preview of our AFN's platform priorities we will be sharing with each of the party leaders over the coming days. There will be more in the document that we release next week, and we'd like you all to read with us and help us along that in the month ahead, because the challenges and the opportunities are so significant to Canada's future, and we need your help. As voters, ask themselves which party is best to steer Canada through this new era of U.S. colonialism. We suggest asking a second but very related question. Which party has the best plan to work with First Nations to unlock the full potential of Canada's First Nations economy and keep our new era of reconciliation moving forward? The Assembly of First Nations will be ready to engage with the next Prime Minister and the members of Parliament from all parties in the next Parliament. In these challenging times, we look forward to advancing our shared priorities and rowing alongside Canada to build a better future for all. From the War of 1812 and throughout Canada's history, First Nations have bravely fought for this country when it faced a crisis, and now it's another one of those times. So we need to be ready. We saw with the pandemic how global events can overtake our lives at home. And thankfully, Trump is not an unseeable and unstoppable virus. Unlike the pandemic, which separated and isolated us, this global threat is unifying and bringing us together more than ever before, and I want to commend all of you for that. And I'm gonna leave it there. There's 100 other pages, but that's from my heart. I think we look for your support. We look for your the way forward as we navigate through this very important election. We want to make sure that we provide the Canadian Club of Toronto, my staff are in the room, that we make sure that each of you get a copy of our priorities document in the days ahead, because we need your support and help in this country as we navigate and work more closely together than ever before. And I'm glad that if there's one thing that somebody from the South brought to us, it's our hearts together, and to realize that we have to expand further and diversify ourselves, and then being so reliant on our big brother next door that's supposed to be a good big brother that's not being a good big brother right now. And I'll leave that there. Thank you so very much. All right. Thank you. Chimigwech. So I just got this new bonnet from the Chiefs of Ontario, some Chiefs of Ontario, and I want to thank you for that, but it's a little baggy. My head didn't grow into it yet.
I'm just wondering if this is working.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. I don't know how I follow that, because it's so much important information to absorb. And I remember when we were inviting you to the Canadian Club to speak, it was before the election as well, and we were talking about, well, self-determination. People would keep talking about economic reconciliation, and what does that really mean? And a lot of it has to do with self-determination for our peoples and having a say to make informed decisions, being part of the decision-making, for one thing, right? And I think your message there resonates. We want to be part of the system. We want to be part of these other governments when they make decisions that impact our communities. And I think during this pivotal time, there's an increase in terms of whatever the political party stance is, they want to move forward on productivity, right? Which means more major projects, and whatever that looks like going forward. And it's the question of how our nations join in that process. And I think it's a pivotal time where how we empower our nations and how we can support them into taking part in these, based on this pivotal time. I think it's like, this is the opportunity. And it's because, as you said, if these projects go forward, they can't do this without First Nations partnerships. And I truly believe that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned about Team Canada. And I just want to ask, well, how do you envision being part of Team Canada?
Absolutely. Look, I think that's an important question, and it's one that I've had with all the leaders in this country, the political leaders, for sure. And, the provinces and the federal government go and meet. And they'll meet with us as First Nations, but they always meet with us like the day before or the morning of for an hour at the little kiddie table. And I think that that's unacceptable in 2025. And I think that it's important now that, just as we are nation to nation, Chief Miracle reminded me about this this morning, to make sure that we mention that we're tired of being at the little kiddie table. We're just asking for a seat at the table to have our voices heard. Provinces and the federal government get a say, but yet they don't have a seat for First Peoples at that table to talk about that. And I think that's one start. And I think, if we really want to talk about Team Canada and growing globally, we have to look at First Nations people and how we exclude them on something as basic as banking. And we have chiefs in the room here, and many of, big banks would say, well, you have to, if you want to, something as small as a home on a First Nation community, well, you better go and ask an Indigenous lender. You can't come to the major bank because you're under the Indian Act. Things like that are really hard discussions to have on being more inclusive for First Nations. And that's off the cuff. I know my staff will, but my writers. But I really think from a logistical point, being more inclusive to First Nations in this country, and let's have a real serious talk about opening up those tables with each other. And they're not easy to have, but we have to have them and find a different way.
No, for sure. And just picking up on your travels in the U.S. So I see through your social network, you've been spending a lot of time with our neighbors, the U.S. tribal leaders. And what have they been saying to you? And what do they think about all this stuff that's happening?
Well, first of all, I want to say, I know Canada itself had asked that I make sure that I'm out there reaching out to our tribes in the U.S. And as First Nations have always done, we're here to help. We're here to open doors. We're here to make our circle bigger, and but talking with the tribes there for sure. And then one of them corrected me at one point. They because we've been calling to keep people at home and finding an Indigenous destination to travel at this year. And some of the tribes there said, but don't forget us, because we've never had these borders before, and they still want us to visit their communities and their lands on the U.S. side of the border. And so I think that's one thing that really resonated when in meeting with all of them and continuing to meet with them. But beautiful people, and those are our cousins right next door. And I think I want to remember that. Yeah.
Yep, that way, because I have family that live in Akwesasne. And through my brother married a Mohawk. Won't talk about that. Just joking. but they describe the dynamics, and pretty much they don't see the border. It's their whole community of Akwesasne, which is divided between Ontario, Quebec, and the States, right? It's complicated, but they're all one nation. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I know because of timing, and but I think we can. I don't think it's fair just to point to have 45 minutes or less to have this, in terms of the amount of time dedicated to this important discussion. But I think we're going to definitely echo, your statement and, share the information, and so that people can be better informed and educated about First Nations priorities.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's Chimigwech.
Oh, Chimigwech. Yobmin Minawamina. Thank you so very much for having me.
Thank you.
Just before, I want to give you a gift. I'm so proud of you for your work. My dad always says, honor people when they're here on this earth, not when they're gone. And I want to honor these two beautiful Ikwe's. And Tabatha, thank you so much for helping us. And she's such a strong, strong business leader in our country. And I thank you so much for being a strong woman and helping us navigate through these tumultuous times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know. Oh, photo. Oh, she's gone. We'll take a photo after. we take a photo after. We have. I think I have the other. Yeah, they're eyeing me. So I know we don't have a lot of time left, but that's okay. And thanks, Tabatha, for being here. I think just a couple of questions. So, what resonated with you in terms of the AFN's priorities in terms of the next election, and how does that resonate in the work that you do?
Sure. Well, first, Mugratch for having me. Thank you to the Canadian Club and National Chief. It's an incredible honor to follow you on stage. I would say what really resonates is, at the beginning of the National Chief's words, talking about like the specific human rights gaps that still exist in our communities, to then talk about the growth that we're seeing in Indigenous business. And I think what really strikes me so much is just that resilience that we have as Indigenous people and that we see First Nations people have. We're still fighting barriers with infrastructure in communities, which makes it very difficult to grow a business, very difficult to do manufacturing in a community, as an example, without clean water, without proper power in those communities. So that infrastructure is a barrier that already exists. And also the Indian Act barriers that also do exist and that First Nation businesses, particularly those on reserve, still face. But I think the part in that hope is that resilience, that despite all of that, we're still growing our businesses, we're still growing economies, we're still showing up here, wanting to be partners, wanting to work with corporations and wanting to build business together. And I would say the other piece is the Team Canada part. I know we're going to talk about this, but I have had the opportunity to sit on the Prime Minister's Council for Canada-US Relations, and that's an incredible honor because, Indigenous people historically haven't been invited to those tables, particularly with respect to business, and that's why I think today's conversation, to be here at the Canadian Club and see so many chiefs here and Indigenous friends and business colleagues is really incredible and a demonstration of where we are today. But I completely agree with the conversation that we need to have rights leader conversations, and they need to be at those tables, at the First Minister's table, at the Premier's table. The council that we sit at is really just about business, and I continually remind the council that I am there with respect to business and our members and other Indigenous businesses, but the rights conversations need to be happening, and they need to be happening yesterday.
No, I agree. I mean, when I was in Prime Minister's office, it was often a call upon the Prime Minister to involve the national Indigenous organizations, be part of the First Minister's meeting. And it was always an issue with, I'll say, the provinces and territories. And it was always a fighting, not fighting, but a bit of opinions, yes, you would say. And but I do think cooperation is very fundamental to getting things done. And that's the only way you can get things done, unfortunately. I mean, not unfortunately, but I mean, it's just a prime example. I know we received news about another MMIWG finding in the landfill in Manitoba. And it resonates with me too, because the search wouldn't happen if there wasn't cooperation between governments, between nations. And that's so fundamental to getting things done right, I have to say. It's not easy work, but it needs to be done. And then whether you're at the First Minister's meeting or you're at the Prime Minister's council table, having your voices, First Nations voices there are so important, whether it's business or our chiefs that resonate there, because they speak for us, and we need the advocacy. And I just want to thank you so much for the advocacy that you do, because it's so important, really important. But before we go, this is the last question. Based on your work, then with your CCIB work, you're the president CEO of a fund, like such a great organization, and then I can talk about it forever too, because I'm very close to that too, in terms of my own family connections to the CCIB, but as well as your work at the Prime Minister's table. What message do you want for our audience? And by the way, there's 200 people online as well listening to this conversation. What key messages that you want them in terms of supporting Indigenous businesses going forward?
Yeah, I think, many people have said this, but in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And I think we've seen that here in Canada coming together and looking domestically at how we can support Canadian business, looking at alternatives to suppliers from the US and partnerships. And as we also talk about how are we going to move forward to build infrastructure in this country and how are we going to build infrastructure faster, I think a few things. One, a huge reminder to everybody that yes, things need to move faster and we need to change the regulatory process, but we cannot skip the steps of working with Indigenous communities in that process. And part of that is about partnerships. So the opportunity is that we need corporations and government to think about Indigenous communities and businesses as an opportunity, as a benefit to your business. From an investment point of view, working with an Indigenous partner, having an Indigenous partner reduces the risk of your investment. It's an opportunity to really invest not in just a great project, but a project that supports Indigenous communities, Indigenous businesses, Indigenous workers, and Canada in growing Canadian economy. And I think too, we talk so much at Canadian Council for Indigenous Business on the importance of procurement. It is a simple way that your business or you as a Canadian can help to grow the Indigenous economy, and there are Indigenous businesses in every sector and size. And we need all levels of government and all corporations to look at where they're purchasing products and look for an Indigenous alternative. Mm-hmm. That is a simple win that anybody can do. It doesn't increase your budget. It doesn't increase your taxes. It really is just about looking at where you're spending money and making sure that it's important. And the last piece I'll say is that we are seeing in the US so many corporations move away from DEI, and we're actively watching our members that have operations here in Canada. But I want to be very clear that working with Indigenous people and businesses is not DEI. We have rights under the Constitution. It is an obligation of every Canadian and every corporation to ensure that their work with Indigenous peoples continues despite the conversation of wokeism and backing away from DEI.
I was going to say, so not that way, and like you speak truth, and I would again listen. I think we should have a whole day or week in terms of just focusing on this issue. That's for sure. But I know we all got work to do, and in terms of everyone will be going back to their offices, they're going back to their daily, what is it that you do? But I'm just thinking about, there's a lot to take here. And I hope we gave you some food for thought. And I'd like to take the time to thank the National Chief for coming here. And I've seen your growth as well. I've known you before I've known you since you were a staffer to the previous National Chief. And I love seeing you grow. And same thing with Tabatha. And which means I'm lifting you up in my own language. I'm, blessing you. And then in terms of everyone as well, thank you for being here. I'm lifting you up as well, and take these teachings in terms of key messages, and hopefully you think about them thoughtfully. And then the other piece, I wanted to thank our tech people, the VVC, for being here, because they're the ones that make this all happen. And I know you were here early in the morning when I arrived here at 8 o'clock a.m. and because I had to come in from Ottawa. And then just Kishimi Ngwech for everybody. And that's it.